Okay, let us
Got it.
begin.
We're ready to roll.
Let's do a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cameras, action.
Roll. Okay, so I'll begin with a story. The personal story was, let me see if I could get the year. I can't get the year, but when I was probably in my mid-20s, my dad of blessed memory, calls me in. He says, "Nachum, I need to speak to you." He said, "I just got back from the doctor and I've got a very rare kidney disease. It's a very unusual disease, and I've got plenty of years left, but it's gonna, my kidneys are gonna go." And that began, and I must have been, oh man, probably in my mid-20s. No, yeah, early 20s. By the time, shortly thereafter, it became apparent that my dad was going to need a kidney transplant. So I wanted to donate my kidney, but I was not the right fit. No, it was not a good match. So I wasn't able to. Turns out that his best friend, my family friend, was the right match, and he donated a kidney to my dad and gave my dad another good 12 years of, he was able to see all of his grandkids, more than that, 15 years where he's able to see his grandkids, walk his, daughter, down the chuppah.
Did he invent any missiles during that time?
Invented some, who knows what type of, top secret things he did during that time. And, but eventually his kidney, even the donated kidney, it wouldn't last. And, ultimately that probably is what contributed to my dad's passing, whatever it was, 3 years ago. And it was during that whole saga and during that whole time where, it really hit me on a personal level, just how important organ donation is and how it really saves lives. I haven't looked at the numbers, but if you go to whatever website carries this information, you'll see, I'm going to guess there's probably about 150,000 to 200,000 people today that are waiting desperately for organs. The overwhelming majority of those people who are waiting for organ donations are kidney donors. I'm sure, I don't have the data, Rabbi, but I'm sure it's more than 90%, significantly more. And it was, right before COVID was, the whole idea of organ donation and how important it is and how it really saves lives. My wife, who really doesn't, she likes being very private about it, but I'm her husband. I could humiliate her every now and again. So, my wife really saw, just how much life, organ donation, gave to my father. And it was right before, it was February, right before COVID. So my wife actually donated her kidney anonymously. We don't even know who the recipient was. Someone in LA, from the last that we've heard, is living a happy, healthy life. Organ donation saves lives. It absolutely does. I've seen it. I've been personally touched in my life in a very, very real way. And it really leads to the question is, well, okay, there's something called, you could be a live kidney donor. And I'm going to actually take a moment. Hold on, if you're familiar with Renewal. Renewal is a Jewish organization. I mean, they're really open to the greater community. If someone is potentially interested in being a live kidney donor, they will help you through that process. I know with me and my wife, she would not have been able to donate on any of it. Would not have been able to donate without the help of Renewal, their guidance, their support. They really took care of everything. Organ donation saves lives. There are two ways that we use that organs are, it's a gross word, but they're harvested. There are two ways that organs are harvested. You can be a live kidney donor, or cadaverically. If lo aleinu, God forbid, and this is what really connects to our discussion, if someone dies, in theory, organs can be donated, and they can absolutely save lives, whether it be kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs. Again, I'm not a physician, but they really do save lives. And the question is, what's the Jewish thought about organ donation? So step one is live donation. Again, really there are ways of doing, like you could donate part of your liver, but it's very few and far between.
I almost donated part of my bone marrow.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the patient actually passed before we could finish the procedure.
So bone marrow, I've had two of my brothers-in-law saved lives being bone marrow donors. Those are the forms of living donation. Living organ donation, tissue donation, blood, all that stuff, huge mitzvah. And obviously these are very personal decisions. Everyone has to really think hard and think twice about going about doing that. But just for the record, live kidney donations, blood marrow, big mitzvah. The question is what's the Jewish philosophy about cadaveric donation, about donating one's organs, after one dies? You get yourself a driver's license. It's one of those things that they'll ask you, click here if you want to be an organ donor. And the question is what's the Jewish perspective about organ donation post-death? So we're going to take a few minutes. This really we want to try to talk about this last week, but we'll touch on it, briefly now.
Sounds good.
Okay. In order to again, I'm not a physician. We'll just kind of touch on this briefly. To understand how organ donation works cadaverically, how they remove kidney donation, how they remove organs, all organs, is basically the way it works is like this. A little bit of biology. There are two different systems there are many systems in the human body, but two that we need to focus on. One is the pulmonary system, which is your lungs, and the other is the cardiovascular system, your heart. And to recognize what keeps one's heart beating and what keeps one breathing are two totally separate things. A person theoretically doesn't need their brain for their heart to beat. A person's heart beats again, this is where I'm way out of my league, but Google informs me that is that we have something called, there's the SA node, which is a particular spot on one's heart. And the SA node is actually what contributes and gives the heart the signal to keep on beating. So theoretically, a person could have no brain. We could literally remove a person's brain and the heart will still beat because it's still getting the signal from the SA node. The problem is that for the heart to beat, the heart needs also to get oxygenated, which leads to the pulmonary system. The way your lungs operate, the person's lungs work because of one's brain. The brain sends a signal to the diaphragm to contract. The lungs bring in air, which oxygenate the blood, and thereby both systems are very deeply connected. Back in the good old days, if either one of those systems failed, the other one would fail pretty immediately thereafter, within a matter of minutes. The person stopped breathing, so the heart would still beat for a few minutes because even though, let's say, if the person's suffered some serious trauma, you don't need the brain, the heart would still beat, but a person would be breathing, there's not enough oxygen in the blood, and eventually the heart would die. The two systems are really, really independent. And it wasn't until invention of modern technology, the iron lungs, certain other types of machines, ventilation, where they kind of realized that you could sort of have one without the other. Namely, a person's brain can be completely dead, let's say from trauma or for some other disease. A person's brainstem could be totally dead and a person is not breathing. But if we ventilate that patient, the heart will keep on pumping for days, weeks, months, and even years, which led to a remarkable insight. Let's say if we can do that to a patient, you can now have a situation where a patient is brain dead, but their heart is still pumping. And the reason why that's very, very valuable is when it comes to organ transplantation, because the way it works is when a person, back in the good old days, when a person used to die and both systems shut down, once the organs stop receiving oxygenated blood, they lose their viability for transplantation very, very, very quickly. Person, the organ, kidneys, the liver, all these things, the heart itself, it's no longer viable to be transplanted very quickly because it's not the liver, let's say, or the kidneys are not receiving oxygenated blood. The question which emerged really in the late 70s and early 80s is, well, wait a minute. Let's say if when a person's brain stops, If we go ahead and we decide or we declare morally, ethically, legally that that person is dead, so we now have a situation where a person's organs are still working, they're still receiving the blood, but the person is dead, and maybe we can transplant. The reason why this is so important is because of an idea, Rabbi, which we talked about last week. We talked about last week how important in Judaism the idea of lo tirtzach is, thou shalt not kill. And we talked about in Judaism, and this is, I think, true probably in all cultures. If, let's say, theoretically, I've got a really, really sick patient. Patient A is critically ill, but he's alive. And I decide, you know what, but patient B is, just needs a new kidney. And if patient B gets a kidney, he'll live a happy life. But patient A, is not living for more than another 5 minutes, but he's still alive.
But he's still using that kidney.
Can we take, or his heart, can we take the patient A's heart and give it to patient B? Patient A is going to die in an hour. So I got a great idea. Let's take patient A's heart and give it to patient B who desperately needs a heart transplant. And the answer is, I think any normal, ethical system will say, of course you cannot do that. You cannot kill one patient to save another. You cannot remove the organs of a live patient, even if that patient is critically ill, to save another patient, even if it means giving that second patient 20 more years of life with their kids, grandkids, walk their daughter down the chuppah. No ethical culture would say that that's okay. Well, in the 80s, when they had this discovery or the advancement of medical therapy and technology, where we realized, well, wait a minute, let's say a patient's brain is completely not operational, what we would call brain dead, but we ventilate the patient, so the patient's heart is still beating, thereby the organs of that patient are still alive. If we can say, yeah, but patient A is now legally, morally, ethically dead, we've got a great idea. We can now remove the heart, the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, the everything from patient A and use it for patients B, C, and D who desperately need those organs, because after all, patient A, we've decided is dead. We're not killing patient A. Patient A is already dead. This issue began to come up as I mentioned, in the late 70s and early 80s, when we had the technologies of ventilation, things like that, to start removing the organs. And beginning in the 80s, then the late 80s and the early 90s, basically the way I understand it, I think every one of the 50 states in the United States of America has declared that brain death is death, and thereby allowing organ transplantation. And the $1 million question is what does the Torah say about it?
I was about to say, so what does
the Torah say about it? Glad you asked. The answer is it's I don't want to skirt the issue. It's obviously very nuanced. It's remarkable how the Talmud actually is something. It's like if you would have read the Talmud 50 years ago, some of these conversations the Talmud is having, you'd be like, it's some weird theoretical, case where a person's breathing, but their heart isn't working, or vice versa. A person's heart is working, but their brain isn't working. And again, 50 years ago, there was no such thing. It didn't really exist. Yet the Talmud, shockingly, because the Talmud, again, is the word of God, God, I guess, envisioned that this would happen one day. The Talmud remarkably discusses it. There's a lot of discussion. Even though the Talmud directly discusses the case, the question is kind of what's the bottom line? A good analogy someone once told me is the Talmud is like mathematics, if you talk about building a bridge, you have the mathematics and you have the engineering. The Talmud is the mathematics. The modern poskim are the engineers. It's a remark. Isn't that a good analogy?
Yeah.
It's a very good analogy. So the Talmud talks about the mathematics of the case. The overwhelming majority of the halachic decisors end up saying that the bottom line is brain death is in Jewish law not considered death, and therefore organ donation would be prohibited in the Torah. You cannot take someone's heart to save the next patient, even though patient A is critically ill.
And just to kind of put that in context that we were talking about last week, is once we do say that this patient is not dead, then everything we discussed last week, it kind of triggers everything we discussed last week. All the halachas, lo tirtzach, is you have great intentions, but the bottom line is the Torah says thou shalt not kill. And the only conversation here is what's the Torah's definition of killing. And as Rabbi Meth is explaining, the vast majority of modern halakha decisors are saying that brain death is not enough. The heart's still beating, the patient's still alive.
And, it's worth pointing out, so does that mean Judaism is against donating? I want to actually flag something if I can. Sure. There's a misconception that I was actually under the impression also. I remember going back to that original story when my dad was critically ill and, before he got his first transplant. And I remember I didn't know any of this stuff of organ donation. I had heard through the grapevine, Judaism doesn't believe in organ donation. And I remember asking my rabbi, I was under this misconception that the reason why Judaism doesn't like organ donation is because something we'll talk about a little bit later in tonight's class. Judaism puts a real premium on something that's called nivul hames. You don't want to defile a dead body, a corpse. It has a certain sanctity. We're going to talk about burial and how we treat, how we treat, the body and this and that. And I remember talking to my rabbi. I said, because of that, we're not going to save a life. And my rabbi said, no, of course we would. There is a concept and there is a value in Judaism of treating, a dead body and a corpse with tremendous respect. But saving a life certainly comes first, no question. The issue which he enlightened me to is that, but you cannot kill, no matter how ill or fragile one patient is, you cannot kill one patient to save the other. And it's just a matter of deciding, is a brain dead patient dead? And, the issue of defilement of a corpse, that's not the issue. It boils down to one thing. Is a brain dead patient considered dead? And it's worth pointing out, Rabbi, that something that it's not necessarily too far out in the future. Right now, the only way to keep organs of a patient alive is through ventilation and keeping the heart alive. If theoretically there is a way of keeping organs viable after cardiac death, so then Judaism would, I think, definitely would be okay with organ donation. The problem is that technology today isn't really practically there. We're theoretically, not even theoretically, we are practically there. It's just not, right now, it's not financially viable. There are some weird situations and some weird occurrences where organ donation would work, but they're not practical yet. But it might be, 20 years from today. But as technology is today, it's a matter of relying on the fact that a brain dead patient is dead, and Judaism just simply says, based on the sources, a brain dead patient, if the person's heart is still beating, that person is still alive.
Good.
And that's the story. It is worth pointing out, if I could just add one last thing, even if you read the early papers and the early conversations, there are some seminal papers that really got the conversation in the United States going. There was the 1968 Harvard ad hoc study. I think if I sent it in the email on the first class, I didn't send it on the second class, but the sources are there. The 1981 presidential study, the 19 something or other, the white paper. There were a couple seminal works where they talk about the issue of brain death in modern American law. And all of them argue that, hey, if we advocate and we go ahead and acknowledge brain death is death, we're going to open up organ donation. We might save so many patients. And if you really stop just from a cold calculated perspective, while I understand, that's a noble goal, clearly, and as we said, Judaism places such a premium on saving life. That's not really the right, and that's a little bit putting the cart before the horse. That's kind of like shrinking the football field to say you scored a touchdown. If a person is alive, they're alive. We should really, the first consideration is, let's define death. That's the first question. It shouldn't be, how many patients can we save? I don't care how many patients you could save. You cannot kill someone to save somebody else. So a little bit, even in all those studies, you see a little bit there's an agenda here, which is a noble, their bias is a noble bias, but it's not really answering the question correctly.
Yeah. I just want to end this segment with just a quick story. It happened to me this past Friday night. I don't know if everyone on this chat who's here live needs this, where I'm looking at who's here. It's a pretty sophisticated crowd, but this will end up recorded somewhere. So I want to address everyone. So interesting story. We had some guests over Friday night, and one of them was swinging on. We have a tree in the backyard with a tree swing, and he was having a grand old time. I don't know, 6, 7, 10 years old, and then he proceeded to flip off it, land on his shoulder, and break his collarbone. Now, how do I know that? Rameth keeps saying we're not physicians. So how do I know that his collarbone is broken?
Good question.
It was sticking out.
Oh gosh.
It was under his skin, but it was broken. It was a no-brainer.
Oh,
And it's like I've seen enough collarbones in my day to know which ones are sticking out and which ones aren't. So thank God he was okay. He wasn't, freaking out. And we're trying to figure out at Shabbos, how do we handle this? So one of my neighbors is a orthopedist, not Jewish. And I hope he never watches this. I'm about to make fun of him. So I knock on his door. He's a very religious Mormon guy. And I knock on his door and I say, hey, can you help me here? And, he gave me the advice that he gave me, which was he needed to go to the hospital, and which we did in, halachically compliant way. We'll talk about that. Maybe there'll be a next webinar, illness on Shabbos, etc. But what he told me, because he knows I'm Sabbath observant, so I didn't ring the bell or call him or anything like that, is he says, don't worry about it. He says, God will understand. If you got to break this Sabbath, God will understand. I'm thinking to myself that he's an amazing person. I love him to death. Not to death. I love him. I have to be very careful how I speak in this when we're talking about death. I love him. But no, God will not understand. I mean, God will understand if we did the best we can. But the halacha, the Torah teaches us systems. If the system is lo sertzach, don't kill, then, like what you're saying in these papers, where we have this great motivation, God will understand. Yeah, God will understand that we try to follow his word. He wrote a book, he published it. And that's really what Torah Judaism is about, not putting our own brains into it, but trying to figure out what it is that God's will is. So that was just kind of put a human face on that. I want to, this is really still doing housekeeping from last week. So I want to do maybe one more piece of housekeeping from last week, and then we'll jump really onto this week's topic, which is, last week we were talking about a dying patient. There's one more thing that Rameth and I wanted to cover about a dying patient, and that is the mitzvah of vidui, the mitzvah of confession. So there's a mitzvah that at the end of a person's life, and Rameth is going to give us a little bit of a warning of how to apply this mitzvah, is for every person who is leaving this world to repent and to verbally regret the sins that he has committed or she has committed in his or her life. And it's found in the back of the Art Scroll Siddur. It's easy to find, and something that we should know where this is, and we should be aware of it. It's actually quite similar to that which we read on Yom Kippur. So if you read on Yom Kippur with the English, you'll be somewhat familiar with it. And it's an important thing to do. It's a recognition that we're leaving this world. This is our last chance to rectify the mistakes that we've made. The Torah teaches us, throughout the Torah, the idea that God is forgiving when we sincerely, want to do better. And this is our opportunity to do it. Before Rameth gives us a quick warning, I want to tell you my intro personally to Vidui is something that you never want to do as a young rabbi, is say Vidui with a dying patient for the first time. Now, I didn't really like doing it the second time either, or the third time. But specifically that time, I don't know if I'll ever forget, what I got myself into, with basically no notice. Is a friend of mine actually from New York calls me up. He says, my grandfather lives in Vegas and not religious at all. And he's dying. He needs someone to say Vidui. So it was a Sunday afternoon. I was about to go do something with my kids. And I did not do anything with my kids. And I went out to go, he lived in the middle of nowhere. And I went to go say Vidui with him. By the time I got there, I learned from his wife who was there that he had not been responsive for days. He was on hospice and not responsive for days. And nonetheless, the custom is you say Vidui because we don't really know. We don't know what the person's aware of, etc. And we say Vidui. And when I walked in, it was very traumatic for me because he was very, very visibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It was just a very difficult situation to be in. This person was clearly leaving this world not in a very gentle way. And I said the Vidui with him. And I left a little bit, shaken up that, I did the best that I could do to, be a comfort to her. And, said, call me no matter what happens, in the middle of the night, I leave my phone on and just to work out the burial, etc., which we'll get to. And I'm waiting all night for this phone call, doesn't come. I call in the morning and she answers the phone and she said, yeah, my husband, passed at like, 2 or 3 in the morning. So I didn't want to call you. I didn't want to disturb you, but everything's okay. So I said, okay, whatever. We connected, Chaver Kadisha, etc. And we'll get up to all that. And then she said, but Rabbi, I want to tell you something. The way you saw my husband, in that horrible state, he was like that for a number of days. And the moment you left, he was at complete peace.
Wow.
And that's the way he stayed for about 12 hours until he left this world. And so now I was even more freaked out than before I did that. And I called up the rabbi, actually, a colleague of mine, who was just coaching me long distance, as I was just asking questions, making sure that I'd never done this before. And I told him the story, waiting for him to like faint on the side of the phone. And he's like, yeah, that happens all the time.
It's funny. I was going to say, I've had that experience happen to me.
Yeah.
I think, and maybe I'll jump right in, and it is a sensitivity that the halacha discusses, is a patient while they're alive, no matter, even like a dying patient. And, while they're alive, even if they're, from our perspective, they're not conscious, they seem to have no awareness, it's not appropriate to, make funeral plans or talk about, whatever plans need to be taken care of, in front of that patient, because we just don't know the kind of awareness that patient has. And it's very likely, as Rabbi, as you're pointing out, is maybe even something that, like reciting Vidoy, they have that awareness and it puts them at peace. I have literally had that experience. Actually, sadly, the last time that happened wasn't too long ago. It was middle of COVID, a COVID patient who was very, very ill. I went in, I said, patient was totally, not alert, not aware. And, I said the prayers, I said the Vidoy, and, then went out of the room to talk to his daughter. Other daughter comes in. I'm not exaggerating. 30 seconds later, I don't think dad's breathing anymore, and, it's just a certain awareness. There is a tradition of reciting a vidoy. There's a special prayer. It's also found in the back of the Art Scroll Siddur. If a person's not comfortable, getting a rabbi to come to help you out is always a good idea.
Right, Meth is going to remember this. Is I got one of the more shady phone calls of my career. It was about 6 months ago, where someone called up the call pretty much in the middle of the night. My mom's dying. Is there someone who could say vidoy over the phone? And I'm like, I'm not like this, but I'm thinking to myself, no, like we're going to do this right. Your mom's dying. I'll come. It's the middle of COVID or whatever it was, like about a year ago, but I'm going to come because, someone's going to come. And she was floored. And it's like, I got her address, and it was like, it was really in the wrong side of town, like very, really in the wrong side of town. And I texted her, I met an address, and so you called me up like, what's this text mean? I said, if you don't hear from me in about half an hour, please, call or come to this address. Send yourself or come to the address. I'm not comfortable in this environment at all. Thank God it was, it was what it was, and we were able to say the final prayers. But really, again, it's something that a rabbi can help with, and all
don't
these
hesitate.
stages.
Don't hesitate reaching out if you're not comfortable, or if you have a loved one, or if it, God forbid, if it ever comes up, this is what, people are, it's a big help, and never hesitate to reach out. I know to me, to Rabbi Davidowitz, or, any rabbi, I'm sure will be very happy to help. Not happy to help, but willing to help in these difficult situations.
Willing and happy.
Willing and happy.
Yeah.
A note of caution, and this is, I think, what we wanted to get to, which is if let's say you have a desperately ill patient, and it is important to recite prayers, but there's also an important thing that a patient's emotional, psychological state is very important. We don't want people suffering. Number two, if a person's spirit is broken, it can actually hasten their death. It can actually, be physically traumatic as well. So we want to be careful with that. And that should always be a sensitivity. And as we mentioned, you shouldn't be crying in front of, a dying patient, unless it's obviously case specific and it's appropriate. But if it's gonna emotionally harm the patient, be careful with that. Be very, very sensitive. As a matter of fact, the halacha I've always found this to be, I'll read it directly. I found this to be a beautiful halacha. You just see how sensitive our sages, were to these kinds of situations. It talks about, the idea of saying vidoy to a desperately ill patient. And the halacha says, nata lamos, if a person is on the cusp of death, omrim lo hizvado, we tell the person you should repent. However, the omrim lo, we tell the person the following. The concern is if you tell a person time to repent, you're going to die. Like you might totally crush the patient. So what we do is we say, harbe hizvadu velo mesu. We tell the patient, many people have recited this prayer and haven't died.
They've been healed.
They've been healed and lived many, many, years happily. The harbe shalo hizvadu vemesu. However, there have been many, many people who didn't recite this prayer and they did die. As in a merit of reciting this prayer, atachai. The prayer is that hopefully you'll survive, you'll recover. And anyone who goes ahead and repents has a portion of the world to come. And indeed, the halacha goes on to say a patient who, let's say, they can't recite it themselves, they're too ill. It says yisvada belivo, the patient themselves should try to repent in their heart. And we see from here just how sensitive we tend to recite this prayer more often than not, even if, as the halacha tells us, a patient who's in a critical situation. If I would always recommend a patient who's going under any surgery that's significant of sorts, where there's a mortality rate of sorts, should recite the prayer, and that's
and again, I would point out that Chazal, our sages, are not kidding around when they say that it is a merit.
Yeah, that's not a good.
When a person feels that, that they're in a dangerous place, that's certainly very appropriate and meritorious thing to do. Okay, so here's the deal. We're about halfway through. We finished cleaning up. Raimeth and I don't need to stretch. First of all, because we're spotlighted, so it would be embarrassing. Second of all, because we're talking, so we're still awake, but we have you guys muted. So if you want to stretch now, it'll be a great idea. We're not going to keep you for that much longer, but
we'll have you out of here another 2 hours, Rabbi?
At most,
2-3 hours.
At most, yeah. So right now, up until we've been talking to last week, and now until now, the sensitivities, the halachas, the understanding, the tradition about what we do when a person is critically ill, and then even up to death. Now we need to start talking about after death. So the stretching will commence now. I'm not giving you much time to do it, so I suggest that you move quick. Excellent. Okay, perfect. I like this. Amazing. Okay, get down and give me 10. All right, you don't have to do that really. All right, so let's do this. Let's talk about, we're going to put Raimeth back on the spot. This is going to be a recap of last week. What is Judaism all about, Rabbi?
Judaism is all about doing what's right and avoiding what's wrong, because your soul, which is you, lives on in the afterlife, and it's in the afterlife where we reap the satisfaction of all our good choices and have to deal with the consequences of our not such good choices.
Excellent. I feel like we need to do like a 10-part webinar to really break that down, and I'm serious about that, but let's deal with what we can for right now. So we have a body and we have a soul. I am my soul is inhabiting my body. And we talked about last time, as I feel quite an affinity towards it, and what happens upon a person's death. So one might think, or might be told, that upon a person's death, his soul leaves his body, or her soul leaves her body. Not totally true. The Talmud is clear in a number of places that immediately upon a person's death, however we're going to define death, is the soul is still with the body. What does it mean that the soul is with the body? It's hovering over the body, it's in the body. Doesn't really make much of a difference to me, but the soul is there, and the soul is aware of what's going on, and therefore there are many halachas about kavod hameis, honoring the deceased, because they're there. I'll give you a few examples. One of them is the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos 152b says that at a person's funeral, you need to speak nice words about them because they're there and they're listening. Now, again, what that means, I can't answer that question. I don't know because I've never experienced it. I hope to give you an update in about 77 years, right? I'll give you an update about what that looks like.
May have asked him, Rabbi.
That's exactly what it is. So
till 120.
So I'll give you an update. But until then, is I'm going to trust the Talmud at its face value, and the soul actually only departs the body after a proper burial and after the Shiva is over. So there are many, many sources that show there's different levels of the soul leaving the body. The soul leaves the body primarily at the time when the grave is sealed. And then it sounds like it lingers a little bit longer until it's going to separate. There is a fascinating chapter in the book called Derech Hashem, which is a very, very interesting read, very difficult to read, by Moshe Chaim Lotzato. You might know his name from a more famous book that he wrote, Mesilas Yesharim, where he talks about what really is the purpose of death. Why don't we ascend directly from living in this world, which, as we know, is the world of Asiya, the world of doing, and ascend directly to what will be the future of the Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, etc., where our body and our soul are reunified. What's this holding space in the middle? We talked about this last week. Our soul goes into we call the Olam HaNeshamos, the world of spirits, and our body goes underground and begins to disintegrate. That's not the right word. What's the word?
Decompose.
Decompose. Thank you. So what's the reason for that? Okay, this is very, very deep. And everyone, please put on your Kabbalistic hat just for 1 minute, and then we'll jump back onto planet Earth. Basically, this is how it works: is our soul is its job in this world is to take our body and to continuously elevate our body to the point that our body is as spiritually perfect as our soul. And that's what the future will look like. Our body will be completely in sync and in harmony with our soul. The problem is there's something called sin. There's something called spiritual errors. Those spiritual errors, they do not, they impair our soul's ability to properly rectify our body. Therefore, our body and soul need to separate. I'm sorry, this is getting gross, but it's important to talk about, and for the context that we're going to be learning in a little bit. Our body and our soul separates, our body decomposes, it goes back into the earth exactly as God tells us it's supposed to. God tells man, is you were born from the ground and you will return to the ground. That happens, and then sometime in the future, our body is recomposed in a perfect form, reunited with our soul, and that as a unit lives on forever. So all these halachas and these traditions that we're going to be talking about are going to be with the sensitivity of understanding of until the body is properly buried, the soul is around, the soul knows what's going on, and therefore we have to be exceedingly careful with how we treat that body. And B, the significance of burial and the significance of what is ultimately the destiny and the payback for, I mentioned before, the hard years of work that we put in this world to learn Torah and to do mitzvahs and do everything right. That is truly going to happen after this whole process goes through. So with that in mind, there's a very big overarching question that is never, I would say culturally, this was not even a question until quite recently. Yeah. Is burial versus cremation. Rabbi, how many people that you know that you would say know a little bit about the Torah, not very religious, that are considering cremation? What percentage of
significant that are not as observant? It's a very, very significant percentage, and for 1,000,001 different reasons. Some people feel it's better for the environment. Some people, which is a very debatable point. Yes. I think most people will tell you it's not better for the environment. Number two, cost. That I think is usually probably
a huge barrier.
Yeah, that is a huge barrier. And I don't know, some other preference.
There could be cultural reasons.
Or this, that.
But I think it's important to put that in context of this is an entirely new way of doing business.
Yeah.
This really was never done before. And I think once we've discussed the reasons behind doing what we do, it kind of makes sense. Well, if our goal is that our body, left what came from the earth, it's going to return to, it's going to be recomposed, etc. Well, that, burning the body, I'm sorry to use harsh words, so that is the word, is going to impede all those things. There are quite strict halachas about what happens if a person is cremated. Shiva, Kaddish, all these things that we're going to discuss, very, very strict, very, very complicated.
Very complicated.
If you're in that conversation, whether, it's probably no one on this chat right now, I'm pretty sure, but someone's gonna be watching this. If you're in this conversation, do reach out. There are some amazing, amazing resources. Two that I'm aware of is websites lastkindness.org and peacefulreturn.org are two great websites that give you a lot of information, resources, etc. Again, that's lastkindness.org, peacefulreturn.org. There's many, many more, great resources. Reach out to us, reach out to your local halachically observant rabbi. They'll connect you with whatever resources and planning you need to make sure that you can do this the proper way.
I just hop in with just a couple of thoughts. The Torah tells us how to live our lives. The Torah gives us, so many details and guidance on how we should live. And it shouldn't be surprising if the Torah tells us how to live. It tells us how to die. And, I believe deeply in the beauty of the Torah, the system of the Torah. And, sometimes I'll tell this to people, it's worth iterating and then reiterating is, one of the things we just mentioned is a cost. And it is a real barrier. Burial will be, more expensive than cremation. And I just like.
By the way, I don't like arguing with you, especially in public, but I think it depends where you live also. In Las Vegas, that's true. It's not true everywhere.
Okay. But be that as it may, it's one of those things where I think we should, I think like at the Kollel, we tend to be, somewhat gentle. And when it comes to our education, we're not the fire and brimstone type that says, if you don't observe X, Y, and Z mitzvah, you're all, going to hell very, very quickly. So make sure, we take a little bit, we try to educate a little bit more gently and why this, see the value and this and that. And I think growth needs to happen, in an organic way. The one area I've always found, I don't know if you found this, one area where I usually come out of a little bit my comfort zone and try to be a little bit more assertive is when it comes to cremation versus burial. Whenever I'm dealing with a family or children or whatever it may be, someone who's themselves trying to think about their final plans, I really try to be a little bit more assertive that, let's stretch ourselves to do the right things, for two reasons. I think there are two reasons why I feel very, just on a personal level as a rabbi, while I'm a little bit more assertive, come on, we really should really do the right thing. Number one, there are no backsies. A lot of the mistakes that we make in our lives, if a person's not 100% observant in a particular area. All right, none of us are perfect. And life is about growth. And life is about, doing evolution. More than we did yesterday. Yeah. The problem is when it comes to death and burial and cremation, you kind of really get one shot. There's really no backsies, and eternity is a long time.
Eternity is a long time. I want to cut you off with a quick story. I'm going to ruin one of my classes now. So if you're in one of my classes in the future and I do this again, pretend you didn't hear this.
Deal.
So here's the story. I'm giving a class to a not particularly religious group. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. And I keep talking about the world to come because as we discussed last week, Judaism does not work without the concept of a world to come. It doesn't, it's 1 + 1 = 9. So someone has the guts finally to say Rabbi, what's this deal with the world to come? So I gave them my elevator speech and I said, if you want to talk about it as a group, let's do it next week. And let's dedicate about an hour to going through the Torah perspective on the world to come. And people are very excited about that. And, some of them were excited because they were going to prove me wrong. Some really wanted to know about it. And whatever it is, they came back and they might have even brought some friends. And we had a good chat about the world to come. And, towards the end, I kind of took the pulse of the people who were there, who did I sell? Who did I not sell? And it was fortuitous. I didn't plan it this way, but I think I was on the way I had to make a significant purchase later that day. And I had a nice amount of money sitting in one of those Chase envelopes in my pocket. So at the end of the class, I turned to the people who were the admitted doubters or deniers. And I took the cash out of my pocket and I put it on the table and I said, I'm willing to give you this, let's just say it was $5,000, whatever it is, for your share in the world to come. Would you sell it to me? And I felt a little bad after I did it for putting them on the spot, but I didn't feel bad in the sense that I think that's part of our job, as a good friend, is to help our friends think and really be self-aware. And if you're saying something, do you really believe what you're saying? And it was very uncomfortable. It was very, very uncomfortable. And nobody everyone, and it wasn't just because, oh, they don't take the rabbi's money. I think some of them would be very happy to take my money, but no, there were no takers. And I think it gets to IMF's point. It's like when we're making decisions like this that are eternal, are you really so sure? There's a type of Judaism, there's the tradition of Judaism that's been working for well over 3,000 years. We're here to tell the tale. Historically, it works. It makes sense. There's everything that we're talking about, we can explain. Whatever we've explained, we can, and hopefully we will, it'll get 10 levels deeper in understanding. Yeah. We're trying to go things, it sounds like we're moving slow, but we're actually covering a lot of material here. And to really be so sure, to bet against that, it takes a lot of chutzpah.
Can I tell you a great story I heard recently? Rabbi Noah Weinberger would tell the story. Is fellow comes in and his dad had passed, and he just was talking to Rabbi Weinberger, and he mentioned that the son is a total atheist, not an agnostic, atheist. There is no God, but he said, my dad passed, and he asked, "Can I please say Kaddish?" So, I kept my word. I told my dad, yes. He said, promise. I said, I promise. So I want to keep my word. So he just mentioned to Rabbi Weinberger, so I say Kaddish. But I'm telling you, Rabbi, I'm a total atheist. Rabbi Weinberger turns to me and says, let me ask you a question. If your dad says, I want you to make me a promise, I want you to talk to the wall every day, would you have done it? It's such a great line. Of course he wouldn't have. Of course he wouldn't have. Like, I'm an atheist. No, I think we all kind of get that we have a deeper purpose, and there's a lot more happening. And maybe just to kind of come full circle, another, and I hate to be so direct, but it's something that's I'm very passionate about. Why?
For those of you who know Rabbi Meth, it's shocking that he's passionate about
shocking that I'm passionate about something. Is why I'm like so outspoken, about burial and particularly about cremation is a certain like historical reality that I think especially our generation more than ever, 6 million of our brothers and sisters didn't have the choice. Were not given the opportunity to choose burial, and they were cremated against their wills. All of my grandparents, I have an aunt and uncle, I have an uncle that was cremated by the Nazis, all of my extended family. Like, I sort of feel it's like so important. Like if there's one thing that we should be extra sensitive to, and even if it's a bigger expense, even if it's maybe we're not as, intuitively connected to burial, if not for anything, like we're not that far away from the gas chambers and the crematoria in Auschwitz. I think if there's one mitzvah, we should say, you know what, we're going to hold this, near and dear to us. I think proper Jewish burial, if we're not doing it for ourselves, let's do it for the 6 million, that came before us. I've always felt like it's always resonated with me. And that's why I'm like a little bit more assertive, let's do the right thing when it comes to burial versus cremation.
Okay. I'm not going to argue with you on that one. That's
excellent.
Well said. So with that in mind, let's just try to go through real quick because the hour is late. Let's try to go through real quick some of the basic, observances that we have. And I'm not sure if we're going to cover everything that's on the notes today, but some of the observances. But let me just go a little bit broad, and then we'll see what we have time for, on a little more granular.
And if we run out of time,
level.
we'll do a part 3 or whatever. We'll see.
We might do a part 4
and a part 4.
You never know. Let's talk about just the idea of mourning, because it really fits in very well with what we've been talking about before. So I want to read you something from Rabbeinu Bachya, one of the great Torah scholars. Rabbi Meth, what year do you live?
Rabbeinu Bachya. Well, they're
the real one.
Well, there are 2 of them. So
give me.
There's the Chovos Halavavos.
No, the original, the Ala Torah.
The Rabbeinu Bachya Ala Torah is the late 1200s.
I was going to say that. I just didn't want to get
late
busted
1200s,
in public
early
here.
1300s.
Okay, we're talking about the mitzvah in the Torah. There's a commandment to not grieve excessively. Now, in the last webinar, we were talking about my pet peeve of a celebration of life, which, by the way, I meant to reconnect that, is that when we talk about the soul and therefore the person being present at the funeral, we really do need to choose our words carefully. Because if I'm saying, we're not here to cry about mom's life, we're here to celebrate her life. If that was my mom, after 120 years, she would probably get up with a handbook and set me straight right quick. Are you kidding? I'm here, and you're not crying. You're not sad about that loss. But it kind of speaks to that sensitivity. But the Torah does give us a mitzvah of not mourning excessively. So in some of the details are mentioned by the Torah, and Rabbi Bachi's commentaries are commenting on that. I'm going to read you a quick translation of what he writes. He's talking about certain practices which were the practice of the Amorites because they viewed this world as the essential one. Therefore, when someone died, the person was eternally lost. We are not like that. We are children of God, heirs to his most special inheritance, and we are destined for the world to come. Therefore, we should not cut our bodies nor tear out our hair, for we have confidence that although the body will no longer be in this world, the soul will inherit the world to come, which is the main one. And I think it really gives us that idea. We're going to talk about, and I think Raimeth is motioning. I think he's right. I think we're going to call for a third one if you guys want to join us again, and we'll talk about funeral, mourning, shiva, all that kind of stuff. And I think that would be a good idea. Sense, yeah. And but just as an overall thought, maybe to end with on a bit of a higher note, is to understand it really goes back to what we were talking about last time of death is not, it's not in and of itself a sad thing. This is where we're supposed to be going. We miss the person intensely, but this is the way the world works. You came from the dust, you're going back to the dust, and there's a plan. You're going to be reunited with your body somewhere down the line, reunited with those that you love, etc. So any things you want to wrap up with?
Well, I was just going to add, and I know I think it was on one of the sources. Was it the Torah Mincha who gives the analogy, a good way of looking at it, because it's really like almost like there's a tension. Because on the one hand, Rabbi, as you're pointing out, well, wait a minute, we believe in the afterlife, world to come. So why are we even sad and grieving and mourning, when we lose a loved one? After all, aren't they in a better place? Aren't they, better off? So we should be celebrating, should be happy and rejoicing. And I think the Torah Mincha gives an analogy, if I'm correct. He says, and I don't know if we talked about this last week or when we did, is like, imagine you send your child off to college. If you send your child, on a great journey, they're where they're supposed to be. I think we talked about this last week, but it's still very painful. So, loss is a very, very real emotion. It's a very, very powerful emotion. I think Judaism is very much about being in touch with our emotions. Judaism will not say, don't feel the pain, don't feel the loss. We should feel the loss. However, there is, as Rabbi pointing out, Rabbeinu Bachai and the Torah really tells us, excessive grieving. Well, that's also not okay. So like everything in Judaism, it's all about finding and striking that right balance of feeling, the pain, the grief, which is absolutely real, but at the same time recognizing the eternity of the soul and all the things connected with that as well.
Okay, so Rabbi, the soul is eternal, but this webinar is not. So we have to call this a day or a night and an evening, and we will regroup, please God. I'm not sure when.
Sometime next week. Maybe
sometime next week.
All right, we'll post it on emails and things like that, kind of for the part 3, which we want to talk about some of the more of the ritual of the funeral. We need to probably talk about some more of the ideas in mourning, yard sites, Kaddish, things like that. Maybe to kind of just wrap it up, we'll have to do a part 3.
Amazing. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. The recorded part of the session is now over. If anyone would like to unmute yourselves or ask a question through the chat,